Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where lost truths, ancient mysteries, and forbidden history collide. Let's question the past and uncover what was never meant to be found. While Ireland was ravaged by plagues and famines, local records speak of a small, isolated valley that never fell. For 1,000 years, the village of Clúain nas Gath survived when millions perished. Its secret was not luck, but a strict ancient code. In the sprawling, often tragic tapestry of Irish history, a land defined by invasion, famine, and rebellion, there exist pockets of profound anomaly. These are places that seem to operate outside the accepted narrative, communities whose stories defy the relentless cycles of collapse and resettlement that characterize much of the island's past. One such place, known in local lore as Clúain nas Gath Meadow of Shadows, represents perhaps the most enduring of these exceptions. While the name itself may be a semi-mythical composite drawn from regional folklore, the physical location it refers to is very real, and the evidence it holds points to a remarkable story of continuity. This is not a tale of kings, saints, or heroic battles. It is the quieter, more perplexing story of a small, isolated community that, according to a combination of archaeological data and persistent oral tradition, managed to survive intact for 1,000 years, weathering the storms of plague, conquest, and starvation that brought the rest of the nation to its knees time and time again. The existence of this settlement presents a fundamental question. How did one small valley succeed where so many others failed? The answer appears to lie not in luck or divine intervention, but in a unique combination of geography, social structure, and an unwritten code of survival that governed every aspect of life. The first and most obvious element contributing to the settlement's unique history is its extraordinary geography. Clúain nas Gath is situated within a narrow, steep-sided glacial valley, a deep scar carved into the landscape by the immense power of retreating ice sheets at the end of the last ice age. The valley walls are not merely hills. They are sheer, rocky escarpments that rise dramatically from the valley floor, creating a formidable natural enclosure. For most of its length, the valley is a closed system, a cul-de-sac of stone and earth. It is accessible by only one route, a treacherous, winding path that clings to the side of a cliff before descending sharply to the valley floor. This single point of entry and exit was more than just an inconvenience. It was a strategic asset of immense value. It acted as a natural choke point, easily defended by a small number of people against a much larger force. Any potential invader, whether a Viking raiding party in the 9th century or Cromwellian soldiers in the 17th, would have to advance in single file along a narrow, exposed track, making them exceptionally vulnerable to ambush from above. This inherent defensibility meant that the valley was never an attractive target for conquest. The cost and manpower required to take it would have far outweighed the value of the limited agricultural land and small population within. But the isolation was not merely military, it was also social and economic. The difficult journey required to enter or leave the valley discouraged casual travel and trade. While other communities were situated along rivers, coastlines, or developing road networks, becoming nodes in a larger system of exchange, Clúain nas Gath remained apart. It was a world unto itself, a pocket of humanity that was physically and psychologically detached from the turbulent events unfolding just beyond its stony ramparts. This profound isolation served as its first and most effective line of defense, making the community difficult to find, costly to attack, and inconvenient to incorporate into any larger political or economic system. It became, in effect, a geographical fortress, shielding its inhabitants from the outside world, and allowing them to develop and maintain a unique way of life, undisturbed for centuries. While the landscape provides the stage, it is the archaeological record that provides the tangible evidence for the valley's incredible story of continuity. Modern archaeological techniques, including soil analysis, aerial photography, and geophysical surveys, have revealed a remarkable picture of uninterrupted settlement. Across Ireland, The archaeological landscape is typically one of disruption. Fields are abandoned, settlements are burned and rebuilt, and new styles of pottery and architecture appear, all signaling shifts in population, conquest, or economic collapse. The area surrounding the valley of Clúain na Scath fits this pattern perfectly, showing clear evidence of abandonment during major plague events and resettlement during the English plantations. The valley itself, however, tells a completely different story. The ancient field systems within the valley, faint outlines still visible on the landscape, show a pattern of continuous cultivation that stretches back to the early medieval period, around the 10th century. Unlike the surrounding areas, there are no breaks in this pattern. The same plots of land appear to have been worked year after year, century after century. Soil core samples taken from these fields reinforce this conclusion, showing consistent levels of pollen from crops like oats and barley and charcoal from fires used to clear land, without the layers of sterile, uncultivated soil that would indicate a period of abandonment. This is the agricultural signature of a stable, persistent community that never left. Furthermore, the remains of dwellings found in the valley, while evolving in style over the centuries, are built upon the foundations of older structures in a clear, unbroken lineage. The settlement did not expand and contract dramatically. It maintained a relatively stable size and layout. This is not the archaeology of successive cultures building on the ruins of their predecessors. It is the archaeology of a single, continuous community adapting and enduring in one place. The stones and the soil of Clúain na Scath testify to an anomaly, a place that was never fully abandoned, a population that was never wiped out or displaced. They simply stayed. The third and most enigmatic piece of the puzzle comes not from the ground, but from the unwritten history of the region, its rich and deeply rooted oral tradition. While official historical records, written by monks and aristocrats, largely ignored this small and insignificant valley, local folklore has preserved a unique memory of it. Generations of storytellers in the surrounding areas have passed down tales about the shadow folk, or the Silent Valley. These stories are notably different from typical Irish folklore. They are not grand epics of mythical heroes like Cuchulainn or Finn Mac Cumhaill, nor are they hagiographies of miracle-working saints like Patrick or Bridget. Instead, they are grounded, pragmatic, and slightly unsettling tales about the people of the valley and the strange code they lived by. At the heart of this oral tradition is the concept of a covenant, an comhantu in the Old Irish vernacular. This covenant was not a religious pact with a deity, but a starkly practical social agreement, supposedly forged by the very first families who settled the valley. The foundational principle of this covenant was absolute and uncompromising. The survival of the community as a whole would always and forever outweigh the needs, wants, rights, or even the life of any single individual. It was a philosophy of radical collectivism, born from the harsh realities of their existence in a precarious world. According to the lore, this covenant was not a written document but a living set of rules, enforced by the village elders and ingrained in every child from birth. It governed everything from the distribution of food and the allocation of labor to the response to outside threats. It dictated that in times of scarcity, all food stores became a common resource, shared equally among all families, regardless of who had grown them. It mandated that the defense of the valley's single entrance was the sacred duty of every able-bodied person. Most significantly, the covenant contained clauses for dealing with existential threats like plague or famine. These clauses were said to be the most severe, and were to be invoked only in the direst of circumstances. They called for a complete and total sealing of the valley, a self-imposed quarantine in which no one was allowed in, and more chillingly, no one was allowed out for any reason whatsoever. A family member visiting relatives in a neighboring village when the covenant was invoked would not be allowed to return. A trader who happened to be inside would not be allowed to leave. The community would turn its back on the world, severing all ties, in order to preserve the collective whole. This oral tradition, while impossible to verify with absolute certainty, provides a crucial framework for understanding the archaeological evidence. It suggests that the valley's survival was not an accident of geography, but the result of a conscious and often brutal social strategy. The people of Clúain na Scath were not just isolated, they were isolationist. Their persistence was not passive. It was an active, disciplined, and relentless pursuit of collective survival, guided by an ancient code that placed the community above all else. This covenant, whether a literal historical reality or a folkloric explanation for an observed phenomenon, represents the invisible social architecture that allowed this small anomaly to endure, a silent and shadowed survivor in the long and turbulent history of Ireland. The mid-14th century found Europe in a state of precarious equilibrium. Feudal societies were well established, trade routes crisscrossed the continent, and for the people of a secluded Irish valley like Clúain na Scath, life was governed by the familiar and predictable rhythms of the seasons. Their unique social covenant had been forged to withstand the known threats of Viking raids, inter-clan warfare, and localized famine dangers that were tangible, visible, and could be met with stone, spear, and careful rationing. But in the late 1340s, a new and utterly alien threat began its inexorable march from the east. It was not an army of men, but an invisible predator, a pestilence so swift and deadly that it would fundamentally re-engineer the demographic and psychological landscape of the known world. This was the Great Mortality, the Black Death, and it would become the first true existential test of the valley's brutal philosophy of survival. The success or failure of the covenant would not be measured in battles won, but in the silence of graves that were never dug. The plague's journey to the shores of Ireland was a horror story whispered along the trade winds. Originating in the arid plains of Central Asia, it traveled west with merciless speed, carried in the blood of fleas living on the black rats that infested the cargo holds of merchant ships. By 1347, it had overwhelmed Constantinople and made landfall in Sicily. From there it erupted across Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, leaving a trail of unimaginable devastation. The disease, primarily in its bubonic form, was a grotesque and terrifying ordeal. It began with fever, chills, and exhaustion, soon followed by the appearance of the dreaded buboeswollen, agonizingly painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck, which would turn black as the tissue within died. Delirium and intense pain would follow, with death often coming within a week. The pneumonic form was even more terrifying, spreading directly from person to person through infected droplets in the air and killing its victims, often within 2 days, without even producing the telltale buboes. In the summer of 1348, this unseen assailant arrived in Ireland. It docked at the bustling port towns of Dublin and Drogheda, disembarking from ships carrying wine from Bordeaux and goods from Bristol. From these coastal entry points, it spread like wildfire along the island's primitive road networks and waterways. Irish society, like the rest of Europe, was utterly unprepared for what was unfolding. Medical knowledge was rooted in the ancient theories of humors and miasmas, belief that disease was caused by imbalances in bodily fluids, or by bad air. There was no concept of germ theory, no understanding of contagion by microbes. The plague was widely interpreted as a form of divine punishment, a manifestation of God's wrath upon a sinful world. People responded with prayer, fasting, and processions of flagellants, remedies that were tragically ineffective against the biological reality of Yersinia pestis. The impact on Ireland was catastrophic. The Anglo-Norman towns, with their dense populations and poor sanitation, were hit hardest. In his harrowing contemporary account, the Franciscan friar John Cielwyan of Kilkenny chronicled the apocalypse unfolding around him. He wrote of entire towns left destitute of inhabitants, of a world where the sick did not receive the last sacraments, because priests and confessors were themselves dead or had fled in terror. He described a society in total collapse, where the living were scarcely able to bury the dead, and the psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. "I leave parchment for continuing the work if haply any man survive," Wen wrote in a final, chilling entry. As if I had never been. And to believe that I am writing what is true. I who am waiting for death among the dead. This was the maelstrom that was gathering just beyond the stone ramparts of Clúain na Scath. News of the great pestilence would have arrived not as a formal declaration, but as a series of disturbing and escalating rumors. Perhaps a traitor who frequented the valley failed to appear at the appointed time. Perhaps a lone, terrified traveler, fleeing from a devastated village, was spotted on a distant ridge, only to collapse and die. The stories would have spoken of entire families vanishing in a matter of days, of villages where the silence was broken only by the howling of stray dogs. For the elders of Clúain na Scath, the scattered and terrifying reports would have been filtered through the pragmatic lens of their covenant. They would have recognized this not as a divine punishment to be endured, but as an external threat to be neutralized. The situation would have called for the invocation of the covenant's most extreme and uncompromising measure. The decision to seal the valley would have been a moment of profound and somber gravity. It would not have been a choice made lightly, but a conclusion reached through the brutal calculus of their foundational law. A council of elders, the keepers of the community's oral traditions and the enforcers of the covenant, would have convened. They would have weighed the fragmented news from the outside world against the single, overriding imperative: the survival of the community. The risk of allowing even one infected person, one contaminated piece of cloth, or one disease-carrying rat into their enclosed world was absolute. Any breach could lead to the complete annihilation of every man, woman, and child in the valley. Faced with this existential threat, their course of action was preordained by the code they lived by. They chose complete and total isolation. The enactment of the quarantine was a deliberate and physical act. The single treacherous path that served as the valley's only entrance was declared impassable. This likely involved more than just a proclamation. A permanent guard, drawn from the valley's able-bodied men, would have been posted at the choke point, with strict orders to let no one pass, under any circumstances. They may have even gone further, deliberately creating a rockslide or felling trees to make the path physically unusable, a clear and unambiguous signal to the outside world that the valley was closed. From that moment on, Clúain na Scath became an island, not in a sea of water, but in a sea of death. Life within the valley would have continued, but under a new and tense reality. The inhabitants were safe, but they were also prisoners, walled in by their own geography and their own unforgiving laws. Their survival depended on their self-sufficiency through their stored grains, their healthy livestock, and the crops they could grow within their protected enclave. They had turned their backs on the world, gambling that their isolation would be their salvation. This decision, while ensuring their collective survival, came at an almost unthinkable human cost. The covenant's brutal logic made no allowance for sentiment or personal tragedy. It operated on the level of the species, not the individual. The sealing of the valley was absolute, and its enforcement would have created scenarios of profound cruelty and heartbreak. This is the part of the story that is not recorded in archaeology, but is hinted at in the darkest corners of the regional folklore, the tales of those who were left outside. We can surmise the nature of these tragedies. A young man from the valley who had traveled to a nearby market to trade wool for salt would have returned to find the path blocked and guarded by familiar faces, his own uncles, cousins, and neighbors. His pleas to be let in, his assurances that he was healthy, would have been met with silence and grimly shaken heads. He would have been turned away, condemned to wander a plague-ridden landscape alone. A daughter of the valley, married to a man in a neighboring settlement, might have fled with her children as her new community was ravaged by the pestilence, seeking the sanctuary of her childhood home. She too would have been denied entry, forced to watch the path to safety be barred by her own kin. Her survival, and that of her children, was deemed an acceptable price to pay for the security of the whole. These encounters would have been torturous for all involved. The guards at the path, bound by their sacred oath to the covenant, would have been forced to deny sanctuary to people they knew and loved. Every plea for help, every cry of a child, would have been a test of their resolve. Their duty required them to suppress their most basic human instincts of compassion and empathy. They were saving their community, but they were doing so by performing acts of profound personal cruelty. The psychological scars of these moments would have run deep, becoming a dark and unspoken part of the valley's collective memory. The parish records of the surrounding, decimated areas, though sparse, allude to this phenomenon indirectly. They note the complete disappearance of families known to have connections to the Shadow Valley, and the discovery of bodies on the very trackways that led towards it. These were the victims of the covenant, the collateral damage of a successful survival strategy. The people of Clúain na Scath survived the Black Death, one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, not by discovering a cure or receiving a miracle, but by making a series of horrific, yet rational choices. They secured their future by severing themselves from the present. They lived while the world around them died, but their survival was purchased at a terrible moral price, forever staining the legacy of their isolated meadow with the shadows of those they left to perish outside its walls. The successful navigation of the Black Death was a testament to the brutal, clinical efficacy of the Clúain na Scath covenant. By choosing absolute isolation, the community had survived an acute, fast-moving biological crisis. But survival is not a singular event. It is a continuous process. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, and the memory of the great mortality faded into terrifying folklore, the nature of the threats facing Ireland began to change. The new dangers were not invisible microbes, but the slow, grinding, and deliberate forces of political conquest, cultural assimilation, and economic exploitation. The centuries that followed the plague would see Ireland subjected to a sustained campaign of colonization by its powerful English neighbor, a process designed to systematically dismantle Gaelic society from the ground up. For the inhabitants of the valley, the challenge shifted from repelling a swift and deadly pestilence to resisting a slow-acting poison. The question was no longer whether their fortress walls could keep death out, but whether their unique social structure could withstand the relentless pressure to conform, to submit, and to disappear into the fabric of a new colonial order. Once again, it was the ancient principles of their covenant isolation, collectivism, and an unwavering adherence to their own traditions that would prove to be their most formidable defense. The first and most fundamental assault on Gaelic Ireland was on its relationship with the land. Beginning in the 16th century under the Tudor dynasty and escalating dramatically under the Stuarts and Oliver Cromwell in the 17th, the English crown implemented a policy known as the plantations. This was not merely a military conquest, it was a project of demographic and social engineering. The goal was to break the power of the native Irish chieftains, seize their territory, and plant it with loyal Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. This policy was underpinned by a profound and irreconcilable clash of legal systems and philosophies regarding the very concept of land ownership. To the English, land was a commodity, a form of private property defined by individual title, written deeds, and clear lines of inheritance, typically through primogeniture. Land could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and most importantly for the colonial project, it could be legally confiscated from an individual owner who was deemed rebellious or disloyal. The entire English legal framework was built around this concept of singular, documented ownership. Gaelic Ireland, however, operated on a completely different system, one rooted in the ancient indigenous legal code known as Brehon law. Within the Brehon system, land was not a commodity to be owned by an individual in perpetuity. Instead, it belonged to the Tuath, the local community or petty kingdom, and was held in trust for the benefit of its members by the Fine, the extended kin group. The chieftain or Taoiseach was not a landlord in the English sense. He was a custodian, a manager of the clan's collective resource. He had rights to a certain portion of the land to support his household, But he could not sell or alienate the clan's ancestral territory. Ownership was communal, fluid, and based on kinship and tradition, rather than a piece of parchment locked in a chest. This system, while complex and possessing its own internal hierarchies, was fundamentally collective. It ensured that all members of the kin group had a right to be supported by the land, preventing the kind of mass landlessness that was common in feudal England. It was this fundamental difference that created a legal and administrative shield for the Valley of Clúain na Scath. When the agents of the English crown, the surveyors, cartographers, and administrators began their work of mapping and partitioning Ireland for plantation, they encountered a problem in places like the Valley. Their entire legal apparatus was designed to identify a single owner, a lord or chieftain, who could be forced to surrender his lands to the crown and have them regranted under an English title, thereby making him a subject of the king and his land subject to English law. If the chieftain rebelled, his title could be voided and his lands confiscated. But when these officials, if they ever made the difficult journey into the valley, asked the question, "Who is the lord of this land?" they would have been met with incomprehension. The answer, filtered through the lens of the Covenant and Brehon tradition, would have been something akin to "we are," or "the land belongs to the fine," or perhaps even, "the land belongs to itself and we are its children." To an English administrator, this was legal nonsense. It was a frustrating and seemingly deliberate obfuscation. There was no single title to seize, no individual to declare a traitor, and whose property could then be legally forfeited. To claim the valley, the crown would have had to treat the entire community as a single rebellious entity and undertake a difficult and militarily costly eviction of every family, a far more complex proposition than simply replacing one lord with another. The valley's communal ownership model, a direct expression of the Covenant's collective ethos, made it legally indigestible to the English system. It presented an anomaly that the colonial bureaucracy was ill-equipped to process. This legal resilience was powerfully amplified by the valley's physical geography. The plantations were, above all, an economic enterprise. The crown and the new planters were interested in profitable land, the fertile river valleys, the rich pastures of the Midlands, and the strategic lands around coastal ports. A small, remote, and hard-to-reach valley like Clúain na Scath, with its limited arable land, was of extremely low value. The effort required for surveyors to map it, for soldiers to subdue it, and for planters to colonize it was simply not worth the meager return. It was an administrative headache and a logistical nightmare. It was far easier and more profitable for the colonial authorities to focus their efforts on the more accessible and richer territories, leaving the strange insular community in the Meadow of Shadows, largely to its own devices. Thus, the valley's ancient legal structure and its physical isolation worked in perfect synergy. The law made it difficult to claim, and the geography made it not worth the trouble. It became an invisible footnote in the grand, violent redrawing of the map of Ireland, a tiny pocket of the old Gaelic world that survived simply by being too strange and too troublesome to absorb. As the military and legal conquest of Ireland solidified, the colonial project moved into its next phase, the conquest of the Irish mind. If the plantations were an attack on the body of Gaelic society, the penal laws of the late 17th and 18th centuries were an assault on its soul. Following the defeat of the Catholic King James II at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, a new triumphant Protestant ascendancy enacted a series of draconian laws designed to crush Irish Catholic identity and eliminate any possibility of a future Catholic resurgence. These laws were systematic, comprehensive, and aimed at every facet of cultural and religious life. Catholics were barred from holding public office, from joining the army, and from voting. Their rights to own land were severely restricted. They were forbidden from opening their own schools or teaching in them, and from sending their children abroad for a Catholic education. The practice of the Catholic faith itself was heavily suppressed, with bishops banished and priest hunters paid bounties for capturing unregistered clergy. Crucially, This legislative assault extended to the very heart of Gaelic culture. The Irish language, Gaelge, was targeted as a backward and seditious tongue. English was promoted as the language of commerce, law, and civilization, and the use of Irish became a marker of poverty and disloyalty. The rich oral tradition of Irish poetry and storytelling, the vibrant heritage of traditional music played on the harp and the Uilleann pipesal were denigrated and driven underground. The objective was clear: to sever the Irish people from their own history, their own language, and their own faith, and to remold them into a compliant, English-speaking, and culturally neutered underclass. In much of Ireland, this policy was devastatingly effective. The Irish language retreated from the towns and fertile lowlands into the poorest and most remote coastal and mountainous regions. The great bardic schools disappeared. A sense of cultural shame was deliberately fostered, and generations grew up feeling that their native heritage was an impediment to progress. It was in this climate of aggressive cultural suppression that the valley of Cluain na Scath once again became a fortress, not of stone but of culture. Its profound physical isolation, once a defense against Viking axes and plague-ridden travelers, now served as a shield against the reach of the penal laws. The agents of the state, the magistrate enforcing the ban on Catholic schools, the priest-hunter seeking his bounty, the English-speaking official trying to impose the new order simply did not penetrate this remote and inaccessible enclave. It was off their maps both literally and figuratively. Within the valley's steep walls, the daily life of the community could continue largely untouched by the laws being passed in Dublin. There was no one present to enforce the ban on the Irish language because Irish was the only language spoken. It was the language of the hearth, the field, the lullaby, and the prayer. It was not a banned language. It was simply the air they breathed. The Covenant, with its core principle of preserving the community's way of life, would have elevated this passive cultural survival into an active, conscious act of preservation. The valley would have become a cultural ark. While the great harpists were being persecuted elsewhere, the music would have continued in the valley's homes. While the poets and storytellers were being marginalized in the wider world, the ancient myths and genealogies would have continued to be recited around the turf fires of Cluain na Scath, preserving the community's sense of its own deep history. If a priest, fleeing persecution, sought refuge, the valley's isolation and the community's absolute solidarity would have made it the perfect sanctuary. The Covenant's demand for collective unity would have ensured that no one would betray a fugitive to the authorities, as the safety of the whole depended on the silence of every individual. This act of cultural preservation would have had a powerful, reinforcing effect on the community's social cohesion. In a world that was actively trying to erase their identity, the very act of speaking their language, singing their songs, and telling their stories became a form of resistance. It was a constant daily reaffirmation of who they were, a shared identity that set them apart from the colonial powers. Their culture was not just a collection of traditions. It was the spiritual and psychological glue that held their society together. It reinforced the collective ethos of the Covenant, reminding them that their survival depended on their unity and their faithfulness to the old ways. While the rest of Ireland was being subjected to a forced and painful process of cultural assimilation, the valley became a living library, a sealed environment where the ancient heritage of Gaelic Ireland was not just passively remembered, but actively lived. Its isolation provided the sanctuary, but its internal social contract provided the will to ensure that its soul would not be conquered. The final grinding threat was economic. The confiscation of land under the plantations and the subsequent legal framework created a deeply dysfunctional and exploitative economic system across most of Ireland. Vast swathes of the country came to be owned by a small number of often absentee Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords. The native Irish, dispossessed of their ancestral lands, were transformed into a massive class of tenants at will. They rented small, often marginal plots of land, for which they had to pay exorbitant rents to a hierarchy of middlemen and agents. This system offered no security of tenure, A tenant could be evicted at the whim of the landlord for any reason, a threat that was used to enforce compliance and extract the maximum possible profit. To pay the rent and feed their families, these tenants were forced into a monoculture of the potato, the only crop that could produce enough calories on a tiny patch of land. This created a society living on a knife's edge, where a single bad harvest could mean not only hunger, but eviction and starvation. Long before the cataclysm of the 1840s, Ireland was plagued by frequent and severe regional famines, crises that were brutally exacerbated by an economic system where food was exported from starving districts to pay the rents of absent landlords. The economic model of Cluain na Scath stood in stark and absolute opposition to this predatory system. Its economy, like its legal system, was an expression of the covenant, rooted in the principles of collective security and shared resources, not individual profit and private property. The land as a whole was the community's primary asset, and its purpose was to sustain the community, not to generate rent for an outside owner. While individual families would have worked their own designated plots, the concept of absolute private ownership of resources, especially in times of crisis, was alien. The covenant mandated a system of shared scarcity, a social insurance policy against the caprices of nature. This system would have been tested regularly by the same localized blights and harsh weather that triggered famines elsewhere. Imagine a year when a late frost destroyed the potato crop on the colder, southern-facing slopes of the valley, while the oat and barley crops on the sunnier side thrived. In the landlord-tenant system of the outside world, the families whose potatoes had failed would have starved. They would have had nothing to eat and no way to pay their rent, leading to their eviction and death, even as a neighboring estate might have a surplus of grain. In Cluain na Scath, the covenant would have dictated a completely different outcome. The crisis would have triggered a communal response. The elders would have opened the valley's shared storehouses, small stone structures where surplus grain, cured meats, and other non-perishables were kept. This food would have been distributed to all families according to need, ensuring that no one starved while the community as a whole still had resources. This was both a moral and a deeply pragmatic strategy. Morally, it reflected the deep-seated belief that they were all bound by a shared fate, that the well-being of one was the responsibility of all. Pragmatically, it was a brilliant form of risk management. The community understood that its most valuable asset was its people. A starving family was not just a tragedy. It was a loss of labor, a source of social instability, and a weakening of the collective whole. By ensuring that everyone survived the lean years, they preserved the human capital needed to plant the next year's crops and defend the valley. The system of shared scarcity ensured that the community absorbed the shock of any localized failure, spreading the risk across the entire population. While the rest of Ireland was being progressively impoverished and broken on the wheel of a predatory agricultural capitalism, the valley operated as a resilient, closed-loop, cooperative economy. It was a system designed not for profit but for endurance. It was this economic solidarity, as much as their military and cultural defenses, that allowed the people of Cluain na Scath to weather the centuries of oppression, a quiet, stubborn island of an older and more communal way of life. By the 1840s, Irish society was a structure primed for collapse. The centuries of conquest, land confiscation, and exploitative economic policies had created a deeply impoverished and dangerously vulnerable population. For millions of tenant farmers and landless laborers, life had been reduced to a precarious dependence on a single miraculous crop, the potato. It was a tuber that had arrived from the New World 2 centuries earlier, and had been embraced for its ability to produce an astonishing amount of calories from a very small patch of poor-quality soil. It was the only crop that could both feed a large family and allow them to pay the exorbitant rents demanded by their landlords. This reliance, however, had transformed the Irish countryside into a vast, teetering monoculture. While the system provided a fragile subsistence in good years, it had created a ticking time bomb. A society with no safety net, no diversity, and no resilience. In 1845, that time bomb detonated. A mysterious blight, a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, arrived from North America and swept across Europe. In Ireland, its impact was not just a harvest failure. It was an apocalypse. The Great Famine, or in Gordomorth Great Hunger, was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. A national trauma that would kill over 1 million people and force another million to emigrate, forever scarring the nation's soul. It was in this starving, dying sea of humanity that the Valley of Clúain na Scath faced its final and most profound test. Its survival would not be a matter of fighting a blight they could not see, but of holding fast to its ancient principles in the face of an overwhelming human tragedy, a decision that would once again confirm the brutal, isolating logic of its covenant. The national catastrophe began with a strange and unsettling phenomenon in the late summer of 1845. Farmers across the country noticed an unusual sweet-smelling fog rising from their potato fields. Within days, the leaves on the potato plants blackened and withered as if they had been scorched by fire. When they dug up the tubers, they found not the firm, life-sustaining potatoes they depended on, but a foul-smelling, inedible, putrid slime. The blight was devastatingly efficient. It could ruin a healthy crop in a matter of hours, and the airborne spores spread rapidly on the wind and rain, ensuring that no district was spared. The first year, roughly half of the potato crop was lost. The government of Sir Robert Peel responded by importing Indian corn from America, a measure that was only partially successful as many of the starving people lacked the means to cook the hard kernels and it caused severe digestive problems. The real disaster, however, came in the following years. The blight returned with even greater virulence in 1846, destroying almost the entire crop. This was the point at which the crisis tipped over into a full-blown famine. The scale of the devastation was biblical. For the millions who relied solely on the potato, its disappearance meant that their only source of food had vanished overnight. The scenes that unfolded across the Irish countryside were horrific. Families were found dead in their cabins, their bodies wasted away by starvation. People were seen crawling on their hands and knees along the roads, their mouths green from eating grass and weeds. Sickness followed hunger, as weakened bodies succumbed to diseases like typhus, relapsing fever, and dysentery, which spread like wildfire through the overcrowded and unsanitary workhouses and soup kitchens. The British government's response, now under the leadership of Lord John Russell and his laissez-faire ideology, was tragically inadequate and dogmatic. They believed that interfering with the free market would only worsen the situation, and so they refused to stop the export of other food crops, oats, wheat, barley, and livestock from Ireland to England, even as the Irish people starved. In a cruel and surreal spectacle, cartloads of food were escorted by armed soldiers past starving crowds on their way to the ports for export. The Great Famine was not merely a natural disaster caused by a fungus. It was a man-made catastrophe, brutally exacerbated by a political and economic system that valued profit over human life. In this landscape of horror, the Valley of Clúain na Scath stood as an almost impossible anomaly, a pocket of resilience in a collapsing world. Its survival was not due to luck or some miraculous immunity from the blight. The spores of Phytophthora infestans would have been carried on the wind into the valley just as they were everywhere else, and their potato crop would have suffered the same fate. The crucial difference lay in what the community did when the potatoes failed. Their survival was the direct result of a core principle embedded within their covenant, a principle that the rest of Ireland had been forced to abandon centuries earlier: agricultural diversity. The people of the valley had never succumbed to the dangerous allure of potato monoculture. Their isolation and their self-sufficient, communal economy had preserved the ancient, traditional farming practices that had sustained their ancestors for 1,000 years. While they had adopted the potato as a useful and productive crop, it had never become their sole source of sustenance. It was merely one component in a complex, integrated, and deeply resilient food system. Walking through the fields of Clúain na Scath in 1845 would have revealed a picture of agricultural variety that had all but disappeared from the rest of the Irish landscape. Alongside the blighted potato patches, there would have been fields of hardy oats and barley, crops that were not susceptible to the Phytophthora blight. These grains were a cornerstone of their diet, providing the raw material for porridge, oatcakes, and unleavened bread. They were also a vital source of winter fodder for their livestock. Elsewhere in the valley, one would find plots of kale, turnips, and other hardy vegetables, plants that could survive the cool, damp Irish climate. This agricultural diversity was not a happy accident. It was a deliberate strategy of risk management, passed down through generations. The Covenant's oral tradition would have contained stories of past crop failures, a wheat rust, a barley blight, and the lesson learned from these events was to never become entirely dependent on a single food source. By planting a variety of crops, they ensured that the failure of one would not mean the failure of all. Beyond their cultivated fields, the community possessed two other crucial sources of food. The first was their livestock. Unlike the impoverished tenant farmers of the outside world, who had long since been forced to give up keeping cows or sheep to make way for more potato ground, the people of the valley had maintained their small herds. They had cattle for milk, which provided butter and cheese, and sheep for wool and, on rare occasions, meat. In a time of famine, these animals were not just a source of protein. They were a living, mobile reserve of calories. The second resource was the valley's natural larder. The centuries of living in harmony with their enclosed environment had given them an intimate knowledge of the wild. They knew which wild plants were edible, which mushrooms were safe, and which roots could be boiled for sustenance. The river that flowed through the valley was a reliable source of trout and eels. Their self-sufficient lifestyle meant they had never lost the skills of foraging, hunting, and fishing, skills that had been forgotten or become irrelevant to the tenant farmers whose lives revolved around a single crop. When the potato blight struck, the people of Clúain na Scath were therefore faced with a serious problem, but not an existential crisis. The loss of the potato crop meant a significant reduction in their food supply, and the coming winter would be a lean one. But they were not facing starvation. They still had their grain harvests, their vegetables, their livestock, and the wild resources of the valley. The Covenant would have immediately dictated the response. All food stores would be declared a communal asset. The grain harvest would be carefully rationed. The slaughter of any livestock would be a community decision, and organized foraging parties would be sent out to supplement their stores. The principle of shared scarcity, which had saved them during localized famines in the past, would now be enacted on a valley-wide scale. They would be hungry, but they would survive. They would endure the hardship together, ensuring that no single family bore the brunt of the loss. Their ancient system of agricultural diversity and communal responsibility was their shield against the apocalypse that was consuming the rest of Ireland. The true test of the Covenant, however, was not internal but external. The people of the valley had food, albeit a limited supply. Just beyond their single guarded path, the world was dying in the most horrific way imaginable. The news would have reached them, carried on the gaunt frames of skeletal figures who appeared at the valley's entrance, begging for aid. These were not the plague victims of the 14th century, who inspired a clinical fear of contagion. These were the starving, their plight invoking a far more direct and primal human emotion: compassion. They were fellow Irishmen, women and children, reduced to living skeletons by a catastrophe they could not control. The guards at the pass would have been confronted with scenes from a living hell. A mother, holding a baby already dead from malnutrition, begging for a single oatcake to save her other child. A man once strong and proud, now a broken wraith, offering to work for a lifetime in exchange for a bowl of porridge. These encounters would have been a moral crisis of the highest order. The Covenant had been designed to protect the community from external threats: armies, plagues, and raiders. But what was the correct response when the outside world was not a threat, but a victim? What did the covenant say about a duty to humanity? The answer, once again, was found in the cold, unyielding logic of its primary directive: the survival of the community. The elders would have convened, and the debate would have been agonizing. Their human instincts, their shared sense of kinship with the people outside, would have screamed at them to help. But the pragmatic calculus of the covenant would have presented a different, brutal reality. The valley's food supply, while sufficient to see its own small population through the winter, was finite. It was a carefully calculated reserve. To open their stores to the endless stream of starving refugees at their gate would be to empty their larder in a matter of weeks. It would be a noble, compassionate act, but it would be an act of collective suicide. By trying to save everyone, they would ensure that no one, including their own children, would survive. The choice was between being a brief, doomed beacon of charity in a sea of death, or a silent, enduring island of survival. The covenant, in its ruthless focus on long-term continuity, would have demanded the latter. The decision was made. The valley was sealed once again. The guards at the pass were given their orders, perhaps the most difficult orders they had ever had to follow. They were to turn away the starving. They were to deny food to the dying. They were to enforce the valley's isolation, not against an enemy army, but against the desperate and the helpless. Each refusal, each starving family turned back to a certain death, was a fresh wound on the community's soul. The people of Clúain na Scath survived the Great Famine, but they did so by performing an act of profound and terrible moral triage. They drew a line around themselves and decided that those inside the line would live, and those outside would be left to their fate. Their survival became a ghostly, almost surreal affair. While the rest of Ireland was a landscape of mass graves, overflowing workhouses, and coffin ships heading for America, life within the valley continued. Today, the valley is sparsely populated, its ancient field systems slowly fading. The covenant is now just a story, but it raises a lasting question. In the face of catastrophe, what is the true cost of absolute survival? In the 6th century, the city of Tuam was the pearl trading capital of the Arabian Gulf, its wealth known from Rome to India. Then it vanished from history. Recent discoveries reveal it was not conquered, but fell to an invisible enemy. In the vast, sun-scorched landscapes of the United Arab Emirates, where the modern skylines of Dubai and Abu Dhabi pierce the heavens, history is often perceived as a recent phenomenon, a story written in steel and glass over the past half-century. But beneath the shifting sands and serene turquoise waters of the Arabian Gulf lies a much deeper, more ancient narrative, a history of forgotten kingdoms and lost cities that once connected this region to the great empires of the ancient world. For centuries, fragments of this past surfaced only in the tantalizingly brief mentions of classical geographers and early Islamic scholars, who spoke of prosperous coastal towns whose wealth was built on the iridescent treasure of the sea, the pearl. One of the most prominent of these semi-legendary places was a city known as Tuam, a name that echoed through historical texts as a center of immense wealth and power, before it vanished from the maps and from memory. For generations, Tuam was little more than a ghost, a scholarly footnote. But recent archaeological work on a windswept island off the coast of the UE is transforming this ghost into a tangible reality, unearthing the physical remains of a lost metropolis, and revealing the true scale and significance of this forgotten pearl trading empire. The heart of this remarkable discovery lies on Sania Island, a stretch of land nestled in the Khor al-Bayda Lagoon, under the jurisdiction of the Emirate of Al-Quwain. The island, whose name translates to flashing lights, likely a reference to the intense summer sun glinting off its salt flats, had long been known to local fishermen as a place of old ruins. However, the true extent and importance of these ruins remained hidden until a dedicated and systematic archaeological survey began in recent years. What the team from the Al-Quwain Department of Tourism and Archaeology, in collaboration with international partners, has uncovered is nothing short of breathtaking. They have unearthed not a small fishing village or a minor trading post, but the sprawling, well-organized ruins of a substantial ancient city that flourished for centuries before the rise of Islam. The evidence points to a settlement that was, at its peak in the 6th century AD, one of the largest and most significant urban centers in the entire southern Arabian Gulf. The sheer scale of the settlement is the first indication of its importance. The ruins cover an expansive area, suggesting a population that numbered in the thousands, a significant concentration of people for this period and region. Unlike the scattered, temporary encampments of nomadic Bedouin tribes, the city of Tuam was a permanent, planned urban environment. Aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar have revealed a dense network of streets and alleyways, separating distinct residential quarters. The houses themselves were constructed from local beach rock and marine conglomerate, materials readily available on the island, and were often arranged around open-air courtyards, a traditional architectural style that provided both privacy and relief from the intense heat. The density of these housing units, packed closely together, speaks to a thriving and growing population, a city bustling with life and activity. Beyond the residential areas, archaeologists have identified larger, more imposing structures that hint at a complex social hierarchy and a centralized authority. Some buildings stand out due to their size and more robust construction, featuring thicker walls and multiple rooms. These were likely the residences of the city's elite, the wealthy pearl merchants, the clan chieftains, or the administrators who governed the city. One particularly significant discovery is the large, fortified building, possibly a form of citadel or ruling fort, strategically located to oversee both the settlement and its harbor. The presence of such a structure indicates a society that was not only prosperous but also organized for defense, capable of protecting its immense wealth from pirates or rival powers. The city was not just a random collection of houses. It was a polity, a structured and governed urban center with a clear social order. This level of urbanism on this scale was previously unknown in the pre-Islamic Southern Gulf, forcing a fundamental reassessment of the region's history, shifting it from a sparsely populated periphery to a land of significant, homegrown urban civilizations. The second and perhaps most compelling pillar of evidence identifying Sania Island as a great economic power is the undeniable proof of the engine that drove its wealth, the pearl trade. All along the shores of the ancient city, archaeologists have discovered vast, man-made mounds composed almost entirely of discarded oyster shells. These are not small, incidental piles. They are enormous shell middens, some several meters high and covering vast areas, representing the accumulated waste of centuries of industrial-scale pearling. The sheer volume of shells is staggering, pointing to an operation that involved harvesting millions upon millions of pearl oysters from the shallow, warm waters of the Gulf. This was not a casual or subsistence activity. It was a highly organized, labor-intensive industry that formed the absolute bedrock of the city's economy. The process of pearling was grueling and dangerous. Fleets of small boats or dhows would sail out to the pearl beds, often staying at sea for weeks or months during the long, hot pearling season. The divers, men of incredible physical endurance, would descend to the seabed, sometimes as deep as 20 meters, with nothing more than a stone to weigh them down, a clip on their nose, and a small basket to collect the oysters. They would stay submerged for a minute or more, working quickly to gather as many shells as possible before their breath ran out. It was perilous work, with the constant threat of drowning, decompression sickness, and attacks from sharks or other marine predators. The recovered oysters would be brought back to the city, where they were opened in their tens of thousands. The vast majority would contain no pearl at all. Only a tiny fraction would yield a pearl of sufficient size, luster, and shape to be considered a gem. The mounds of discarded shells on Sania Island are the silent, monumental testament to this incredible effort, the byproduct of an entire society geared towards the relentless pursuit of these tiny iridescent spheres. The pearls harvested at Tuam were not just for local adornment. They were one of the most coveted luxury goods in the ancient world. a symbol of wealth, power, and divine purity. Their journey from the oyster beds of the Gulf to the treasuries of distant empires is a story of global trade. From Tuam, the pearls would have been carefully sorted, graded, and then transported by land and sea. They would have traveled by caravan across the deserts of Arabia to the markets of Palmyra and Petra, or by ship up the Gulf to the great Mesopotamian cities of the Sasanian Persian Empire. From there, they would have entered the vast trade networks of the Silk Road, heading east towards India and China, or west towards the Roman and later Byzantine empires. Roman aristocrats, Sasanian kings, and Indian Maharajas all prized Gulf pearls above all others. They were used to embellish crowns and thrones, to adorn the clothing of the elite, and to be set in exquisite jewelry. The city on Sania Island was a primary production hub for this global supply chain. It was the Wall Street of the ancient pearl trade, a place where the dangerous labor of the divers was transformed into unimaginable wealth, connecting this remote Arabian island to the furthest reaches of the known world. The final piece of evidence that firmly anchors the Sania Island ruins in history is its compelling link to the lost city of Tuam, a name that appears in various ancient texts. While classical Roman and Greek sources, like Pliny the Elder's Natural History, speak generally of the rich pearl fisheries of the Persian Gulf, it is the later Islamic geographers of the 9th and 10th centuries who provide more specific clues. Scholars like Al-Tabari and Al-Makdisi wrote of a city named Tuam, situated in the region of modern-day Al-Quain, which they described as a major regional center that had been powerful and famous for its pearls in the centuries before the advent of Islam. They speak of it as a place that had once dominated the southern Gulf but had, by their time, already fallen into decline or ruin. For centuries, the location of this semi-legendary city remained a mystery, with scholars proposing various sites along the UAE coast. The discoveries on Sania Island now provide the first powerful, tangible candidate for the lost city of Tuam. The geography matches the historical descriptions perfectly. The archaeological evidence confirms a large, thriving city that reached its zenith in the pre-Islamic period, precisely during the 6th century. Most importantly, the overwhelming evidence of industrial-scale pearling aligns perfectly with Tuam's historical reputation as the capital of the pearl trade. The name itself, Tuam, is thought to derive from the Aramaic word teoma, meaning twin, which may be a reference to the twin mounds or features of the lagoon in which it was situated. The convergence of the archaeological evidence, the scale of the city, the time frame of its occupation, and its clear economic focus on pearls with the specific descriptions found in the historical texts creates a powerful and convincing argument. The identification of the Sania Island metropolis as Tuam is more than just solving a historical puzzle. It revolutionizes our understanding of the region's past. It demonstrates that the coast of the UAE in the pre-Islamic era was not a sparsely populated backwater inhabited only by nomadic tribes. It was home to sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful urban centers with far-reaching international connections. The city of Tuam, unearthed on Sania Island, was not an isolated oasis of wealth, a hermit kingdom content to admire its own treasures. Its immense prosperity was not an accident of geography, but the direct result of its strategic and deeply embedded position within the vibrant, sprawling network of global trade that defined the late antique world. The archaeological evidence paints a clear and compelling picture of a city that was profoundly cosmopolitan, a bustling hub where goods, people, and ideas from across continents converged. Tuam was a critical node, a vital link in the great chain of commerce that stretched from the workshops of the Roman Mediterranean to the spice gardens of India and beyond. This very connectivity, however, the lifeblood of its economic existence, was also its greatest vulnerability. The same sea lanes that carried silk-laden dhows and merchant vessels to its harbor also acted as conduits for forces far more dangerous than pirates or rival powers. The story of Tuam's global integration is therefore a story of a double-edged sword, where the pathways to unprecedented wealth were also the pathways to catastrophic ruin. The most tangible evidence of Tuam's far-reaching connections lies in the rich and diverse assortment of foreign artifacts unearthed from its ruins. While the city's primary export was the pearl, its primary imports were the necessities and luxuries that its own island environment could not provide, as well as the status symbols that its wealthy elite craved. The archaeological assemblage from Sania Island is a veritable catalogue of 6th-century international trade. Excavations have yielded vast quantities of pottery, a crucial tool for archaeologists in dating sites and tracing trade links. Among the locally made earthenware, there are significant numbers of imported ceramics. One of the most common types is a distinctive turquoise-glazed pottery, known to have been manufactured in specialized workshops in Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Sasanian Persian Empire. The presence of these vessels, likely used for storing wine, oil, or other valuable liquids, points to a strong and sustained trade relationship with Tuam's powerful Persian neighbors to the north. The trade routes, however, extended far beyond the neighboring Persian Gulf. Archaeologists have also found fine, delicate glassware fragments of bowls, goblets, and perfume bottles, whose chemical composition and manufacturing style link them to the famous glass workshops of the Levant, in what is now modern-day Syria and Lebanon. At that time, this region was a province of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to the Roman Empire. These fragile luxury items would have undertaken a long and perilous journey, traveling by caravan across the desert to the head of the Gulf, and then by ship down to Tuam. Their presence on Sania Island is a testament to the city's immense purchasing power and the desire of its elite to acquire the finest goods the world had to offer. Even more telling is the discovery of coins. While many transactions would have been conducted through barter, the discovery of Byzantine and Sasanian currency provides irrefutable proof of the city's participation in the monetized economies of the two great superpowers of the age. These coins were not just units of exchange. They were symbols of imperial power and economic reach, and their presence in Tuam shows that the city was a recognized player in this high-stakes international arena. The trade was not just with the West. The strategic location of Tuam at the mouth of the Gulf made it a natural gateway to the Indian Ocean. While organic goods like spices from India or silks from China rarely survive in the archaeological record, the presence of certain types of pottery and carnelian beads, known to originate from the Indian subcontinent, confirms that Tuam was a key port of call for ships plying the monsoon trade routes. It was a place where goods from the Mediterranean and Persia could be exchanged for the exotic products of the East. A merchant in Tuam could, in theory, buy Roman glass with Persian silver and trade it for Indian spices, all within the city's bustling marketplace. The city was not at the end of a trade route, it was at its crossroads. This constant flow of foreign goods not only enriched the city but also exposed its inhabitants to a world of different cultures, technologies, and ideas, making Tuam a vibrant, cosmopolitan center in an era of unprecedented global connectivity. The influx of foreign goods was naturally accompanied by an influx of foreign people, and the physical layout of Tuam suggests a society that was not just prosperous, but also remarkably diverse and multicultural. The city was a magnet for merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and adventurers from across the known world, each seeking to make their fortune in the pearl trade. The archaeological evidence for this diversity can be seen in the subtle, but significant variations within the urban landscape. While most of the housing conforms to a local Arab architectural style, with courtyard houses built of beach rock, certain areas of the city exhibit different construction techniques and layouts. Some structures show a clear Persian influence, suggesting a distinct quarter where merchants from the Sasanian Empire may have lived and worked, maintaining their own cultural traditions while participating in the city's economy. Even more compelling is the evidence for religious diversity. The 6th century was a period of intense religious activity and competition across the Middle East. While the Arabian Peninsula is often associated solely with its pre-Islamic polytheistic traditions, other faiths had made significant inroads. The Sasanian Empire to the north was officially Zoroastrian, while the Byzantine Empire to the west was Christian. The trade routes acted as powerful vectors for the transmission of these faiths. One of the most active and successful groups of Christian missionaries and merchants during this period was the Church of the East, often referred to as the Nestorians. This branch of Christianity had established a strong presence all along the trade routes of the Silk Road and the Arabian Gulf, founding bishoprics and monasteries from Mesopotamia all the way to India and China. On Sania Island, just a short distance from the main city of Tuam, archaeologists have discovered the remains of what is believed to be one of these ancient Nestorian monasteries. The complex, dating to the same period as the city's Golden Age, includes a church with a clear cruciform layout, a baptistry, an oven for baking communion wafers, and a number of cells that would have housed the monks. The discovery of this monastery is a landmark find, providing the most concrete evidence to date for a thriving Christian community living alongside the local Arab population in the pre-Islamic UAE. This community was likely deeply involved in the pearl trade, with the monastery itself possibly serving as a center for commerce and diplomacy, as well as a spiritual haven for Christian sailors and merchants passing through the busy port. The city of Tuam, therefore, was likely a place of relative tolerance, where local Arab tribes, Persian Zoroastrians, and Nestorian Christians coexisted, bound together by the shared pursuit of wealth. It was a microcosm of the late antique world, a melting pot of cultures and faiths, all drawn to the singular lure of the pearl. This cosmopolitanism, this deep integration into the global web of commerce and culture, was the very foundation of Tuam's success. The city thrived because it was open to the world. Its merchants understood the complex logistics of long-distance trade. Its sailors knew the monsoon winds, and its rulers were adept at navigating the political currents between the rival Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Their wealth was directly proportional to the number of ships that docked in their harbor and the number of caravans that arrived at their gates. Every new connection was a new opportunity for profit, a new source of exotic goods, and a new affirmation of their city's importance. This openness, however, carried with it a profound and ultimately fatal risk. The intricate network of trade routes that sustained Tuam was a double-edged sword. The ships and caravans that arrived daily were not sterile vessels carrying only inanimate cargo. They were living, breathing ecosystems. They carried crews of sailors and merchants, human beings who could be asymptomatic carriers of infectious diseases. They carried livestock, which could harbor their own pathogens. Most insidiously, they carried stowaways, the ubiquitous black rats that thrived in the dark, warm holds of ships and the grain sacks of caravans. And on these rats lived fleas. This biological network, moving in parallel with the commercial one, was largely invisible and entirely misunderstood in the ancient world. People understood that sickness could spread, but they had no knowledge of the microbial agents responsible. To the people of Tuam, a ship arriving from a distant port was a symbol of prosperity. They could not see the microscopic bacteria or the infected fleas hidden within its cargo. They could not know that the very connections that brought them their fabulous wealth were also making them exquisitely vulnerable to a biological catastrophe originating on the other side of the world. The prosperity of Tuam was therefore directly and inextricably tied to its exposure. The city's economic health depended on its willingness to welcome strangers and goods from every corner of the earth. Unlike an isolated, self-sufficient farming community that could potentially wall itself off from the outside world during a crisis, Tuam could not survive without its connections. To close its port would be to sever its economic lifeline. This created a terrible paradox. The more successful the city became, the more ships arrived. The more ships that arrived, the greater the number of potential points of entry for a communicable disease. The city's wealth was effectively a measure of its risk. Every pearl sold, every foreign coin that jingled in a merchant's purse, was a testament to a system that was simultaneously generating immense prosperity and concentrating systemic, biological risk. The people of Tuam were living on a knife's edge, but they were unaware of the precipice. Their global connections had made them rich beyond measure, but they had also placed them directly in the path of an invisible enemy that would travel along those same routes of commerce, an enemy that would ultimately turn their bustling, cosmopolitan metropolis into a silent city of ghosts. In the middle of the 6th century AD, the city of Tuam stood at the zenith of its power and prosperity. Its harbor was crowded with ships from across the known world. Its markets bustled with a dozen different languages, and its pearls adorned the crowns of emperors and kings. The city's inhabitants, confident in their wealth and their strategic position, could not have known that the very system that sustained them was about to become the vector for their destruction. Far to the west, in the heartlands of the Byzantine Empire, an unprecedented biological catastrophe was beginning to unfold, a pandemic of such terrifying scale and lethality that it would alter the course of history. This was the Justinian Plague, the first great pandemic in recorded human history. It was an unseen enemy that paid no heed to borders, armies, or city walls. It traveled silently and swiftly along the world's great highways of commerce, and the prosperous, well-connected city of Tuam lay directly in its path. The archaeological evidence from Sania Island tells a chilling story not of a city in slow decline, but of a sudden catastrophic collapse, a moment when the vibrant pulse of a great trading metropolis simply stopped. The story of the Justinian Plague begins in the year 541 AD. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, who provided a vivid and terrifying eyewitness account, the pestilence first appeared in the port of Pelusium in Egypt, a major hub for the grain trade that supplied the imperial capital of Constantinople. From this initial outbreak point, the disease exploded with incredible speed, spreading in all directions. Procopius wrote that it seemed to advance by a kind of prearranged plan, moving methodically from the coast inland, and from city to city. By the spring of 542 AD, it had reached Constantinople, the largest and most magnificent city in the Western world. The result was a demographic cataclysm. At the plague's peak, Procopius claimed that 10,000 people were dying in the capital each day. The city's administration completely broke down. There was no one to collect the dead, and bodies were piled in the streets, left in the open or thrown into the sea. The Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease, and though he miraculously survived, the pandemic would forever bear his name. The culprit behind this devastation was a familiar one: the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen that would cause the Black Death in the 14th century. Transmitted by fleas carried on black rats, the plague spread with terrifying efficiency through the densely populated, unsanitary cities of the late antique world. It moved along the two great networks that Justinian's empire had perfected: the network of Roman roads that crisscrossed the land, and the network of shipping lanes that connected every corner of the Mediterranean Sea. From Constantinople, it spread west to Italy and North Africa, and east into the heart of the Sasanian Persian Empire, the Byzantines' great rival. The two empires, which had been locked in a state of near-constant warfare, were both ravaged by the pestilence. It was a truly global event, affecting a vast swathe of Afro-Eurasia and killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people in its initial wave, perhaps a quarter of the world's population at the time. The Justinian Plague was not just a public health crisis. It was a geopolitical event of the first order, weakening both great empires and paving the way for the rise of new powers, including in the following century, the armies of Islam. The question for historians and archaeologists has always been the full extent of the plague's reach. While its devastation in the Mediterranean and the Near East is well documented, its impact on more distant regions like the Arabian Peninsula has been less clear. This is where the discoveries at Tuam become so critically important. The city's deep integration into global trade networks meant it was anything but isolated from this catastrophe. The same ships that brought Byzantine glass and Sasanian pottery to Tuam's harbor were the perfect vessels for transporting the plague. A single merchant ship sailing from Basra or another port in Mesopotamia, where the plague is known to have raged, could have carried infected rats or fleas in its cargo hold. Upon docking in Tuam's busy port, these rats could have scurried ashore, spreading their lethal cargo to the local rat population and from there, to the city's human inhabitants. Modern scientific analysis has provided powerful confirmation of this transmission route. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from the remains of plague victims found at various sites across Europe and Asia, researchers have been able to reconstruct the plague's genetic family tree. These studies confirm that the pandemic spread not just randomly, but specifically along the major arteries of trade. The genetic signature of the plague found in a 6th century burial in Germany can be linked to the strain found in Constantinople, which in turn can be linked to the original outbreak in Africa. It is now almost certain that the plague traveled down the Red Sea and also into the Persian Gulf, following the maritime routes of the spice and pearl trades. A bustling international port like Tuam, with its constant traffic of ships from plague-afflicted regions, was not just a potential target, it was an inevitable one. The very factors that made the city a hub of commerce made it a superspreader node in the geography of the pandemic. The archaeological evidence from Sania Island provides a stark and haunting picture of the plague's arrival and its devastating consequences. The most telling clue is the nature of the city's abandonment. When a city enters a period of slow decline due to economic hardship, political change, or environmental factors, the archaeological record typically reflects this gradual process. The population dwindles over time, peripheral areas of the city are abandoned first, and buildings fall into disrepair slowly. The remaining inhabitants might squat in the ruins of larger buildings, and layers of wind-blown sand or refuse will accumulate over time. The final inhabitants often take their most valuable possessions with them when they leave. The pattern at Tuam is completely different. The evidence points not to a slow decline, but to an abrupt, catastrophic event that brought the life of the city to a sudden and complete halt. Across the excavated areas of the city, archaeologists have found scenes of everyday life frozen in time. In the remains of houses, usable tools like knives and grinding stones are found dropped on the floors, as if their owners simply ceased to exist mid-task. Clay cooking pots, still intact, are found resting on the cold ashes of their hearths. Valuables that would certainly have been taken by a population leaving in an orderly fashion were left behind. This is not the signature of a planned migration. Furthermore, there are no signs of a violent conquest. There are no widespread layers of ash and charcoal that would indicate the city was burned, no collapsed walls from siege engines, and no caches of weapons that would suggest a major battle. The city was not destroyed by an invading army, simply died. The archaeological layers show a vibrant, functioning city, and then, immediately on top of that, a layer of sterile wind-blown sand, signifying abandonment. Something happened at Tuam that caused its entire social and economic system to collapse almost overnight. This pattern of sudden, non-violent abandonment is a classic archaeological signature of a catastrophic epidemic, a moment when the death toll becomes so high and the social fabric so torn that the few remaining survivors choose to flee, leaving everything behind. The city's very structure would have made it incredibly vulnerable to the rapid spread of the plague. The dense, tightly packed housing with narrow alleyways in between would have created ideal conditions for the rat population to thrive and for the disease to pass quickly from house to house. The communal nature of life, with people gathering in markets, mosques, or churches, would have facilitated the spread of the pneumonic form of the disease. The harbor, the city's economic heart, would have been its epidemiological weak point, the primary site of infection, which would then radiate outwards through the city. The social diversity of Tuam, once its strength, would have become a liability. The constant interaction between different ethnic and religious groups, local Arabs, Persian merchants, Nestorian monks, meant that no single community could isolate itself. The plague would have swept through all of them indiscriminately. The impact on the city's specialized economy would have been particularly devastating. The pearl trade was a complex enterprise that depended on a chain of skilled labor. It required healthy, strong divers to harvest the oysters, experienced sailors to man the dhows, and knowledgeable merchants to grade the pearls and negotiate their sale. A massive die-off of the population would have shattered this chain at every link. The ranks of the divers, the most physically demanding job, would have been decimated. With the sailors and captains gone, the pearling fleets would have rotted in the harbor. With the merchants dead, the intricate knowledge of international markets and the personal relationships with buyers in distant lands would have been lost forever. Even if a significant portion of the population had survived, the city's economic engine would have been irreparably broken. The social cohesion and specialized knowledge that had been built up over centuries could be wiped out in a single season of sickness. The Justinian plague did not just kill people. It killed the very systems and structures that made urban life possible. In the case of Tuam, it killed the pearl trade. The survivors, finding themselves in a ghost city, surrounded by the dead and with their livelihood destroyed, would have had little choice. Their only option was to leave, to abandon the cursed island and seek a new life elsewhere, leaving the once great metropolis to be slowly consumed by the wind and the sand. The archaeological evidence of a sudden, non-violent abandonment provided a powerful, albeit circumstantial, case for a catastrophic epidemic being the cause of Tuam's collapse. The pattern of artifacts left in situ, the lack of destruction layers, and the alignment with the known timeline of the Justinian plague all pointed towards a single grim conclusion. But to move from strong theory to scientific certainty required a different kind of evidence, something more direct and irrefutable than pottery shards or the layout of city streets. It required a smoking gun, a direct link between the dead of Tuam and the unseen killer of the 6th century. This crucial piece of the puzzle would not be found in the ruins of the city's houses or markets, but in the bones of its inhabitants, in a place where the final desperate moments of the city's life were starkly preserved. The discovery of a unique burial site on Sania Island, and the subsequent application of cutting-edge biomedical science, would provide the final, definitive proof, revealing the secret that the city's last survivors had taken to their graves. In the course of their systematic survey of the island, archaeologists made a discovery that was profoundly different from the other burial sites they had encountered. The typical pre-Islamic burials in the region, while varying in style, generally showed a high degree of order and respect for the deceased. Individuals were usually buried in single, well-defined graves, often with a few personal items or grave goods. Even the Christian burials at the nearby monastery, while distinct, followed their own prescribed rituals. However, near the main settlement of Tuam, the team unearthed a burial site that defied all these conventions. It was unmistakably a mass grave. Here numerous bodies were interred together in a manner that spoke not of ritual and respect, but of haste, desperation, and overwhelming crisis. The bodies in this burial pit were not carefully arranged. They were placed together in a disordered, almost haphazard fashion, some overlapping their limbs askew. The burial was shallow, suggesting it was dug quickly by a small number of people who were exhausted or running out of time. Crucially, there were no grave goods, no personal adornments or offerings to accompany the dead on their journey to the afterlife. This was not a ceremonial burial. It was a desperate act of sanitation, an emergency measure taken by a community in the throes of a cataclysm. A mass grave is the archaeological signature of a mass casualty event, a moment when the death rate becomes so high that the normal, dignified, and time-consuming rituals of burial become an impossible luxury. The living, weakened themselves and surrounded by death, are forced to abandon tradition in favor of the most pragmatic and immediate solution, disposing of the dead as quickly as possible to prevent the further spread of disease, or simply to clear the streets. The discovery of this specific site provided the first piece of direct, human evidence that a catastrophic event had overwhelmed the city's population and its social structures. The existence of the mass grave was highly suggestive of an epidemic, but it was not conclusive proof. A battle, a massacre, or a natural disaster like a tsunami could also result in mass casualties. The final, irrefutable piece of evidence had to come from within the skeletons themselves. This is where the investigation moved from the domain of traditional archaeology to the cutting-edge science of paleogenetics. In recent years, scientists have developed remarkable techniques to extract and analyze ancient DNA, ADNA, from archaeological remains. DNA, the molecule that carries the genetic instructions for all living organisms, can, under the right conditions, survive for thousands of years, particularly when protected within the dense, hard tissue of teeth and certain bones. This technology has revolutionized our understanding of the past, allowing us to trace human migrations, identify family relationships among ancient peoples, and, most importantly for the mystery of Tuam, to identify the specific pathogens that caused their deaths. The scientific team working on the Sania Island material carefully selected teeth from several of the skeletons found within the mass grave. The dental pulp, a soft tissue inside the tooth, is rich in blood vessels and provides an excellent, protected reservoir for any pathogens that were circulating in an individual's bloodstream at the time of their death. In a highly controlled, sterile laboratory environment, to avoid contamination with modern DNA, the scientists drilled into the teeth and extracted tiny amounts of powdered material. From this powder, they undertook the painstaking process of extracting any surviving fragments of DNA. They were searching not only for human DNA, but also for the genetic signature of a specific, non-human intruder, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The process involved sequencing all the millions of tiny DNA fragments recovered from the samples. This vast dataset was then compared against a comprehensive database of known DNA sequences from humans, animals, plants, and, crucially, a vast library of microbes. The results were clear and unequivocal. Among the human DNA, the computer analysis identified multiple, unique fragments that were a perfect match for the known genome of Yersinia pestis. This was the smoking gun. It was the definitive scientific proof that the individuals buried in this mass grave were not victims of warfare or a natural disaster. They were victims of the plague. The analysis could even identify the specific strain of the bacterium, confirming that it belonged to the same branch of the Yersinia pestis family tree, responsible for the Justinian plague across the rest of the world. The science had confirmed the archaeological theory, directly linking the sudden collapse of Tuam to the first great pandemic in history. This discovery transformed the story of Tuam. It was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a confirmed case study of how a pandemic could completely destroy a complex, prosperous society. The final tragic chapter of the city's life could now be reconstructed with a high degree of confidence. The plague arrived, likely by ship, and spread rapidly through the dense, interconnected city. The death toll would have been staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the Justinian plague had a mortality rate of anywhere from 50% to 60% in urban centers, and in some cases it was even higher. In a matter of weeks, Tuam would have been transformed from a vibrant metropolis into a charnel house. The social fabric would have unraveled with terrifying speed. The city's elite, the merchants and administrators, would have been just as vulnerable as the common laborers. With the leadership gone, law and order would have collapsed. The specialized economy, the city's very reason for being, would have been shattered. The pearl divers, the sailors, the boat builders, the merchants, all the skilled individuals who made the complex trade network function would have been decimated. There would be no one to man the boats, no one to dive for the pearls, and no one to negotiate their sale. The economic engine of Tuam would have seized up completely and irrevocably. For the few who survived, the world would have been a living nightmare. They would have been surrounded by the dead and the dying, haunted by the loss of their families and their community. Their city, once a symbol of wealth and opportunity, was now a cursed place, a giant open tomb. Their livelihood was gone, the trade networks were silent, and their trust in the safety of their home was shattered. There was no reason to stay. Their only logical choice was to flee. A small, traumatized remnant of the population would have gathered what little they could carry and abandoned the island forever, seeking refuge in less affected inland oases or other coastal settlements. They left behind their homes, their possessions, and their dead, leaving the once great city of Tuam to the silence and the sand. The final act of the survivors was likely the hasty burial of their kin in the mass grave, a last desperate attempt to impose a sliver of order on a world consumed by chaos, before they turned their backs on the city and walked away, leaving it to become the ghost that history would forget for nearly 1,500 years. The rediscovery of Tuam is a stark reminder that history's great collapses are not always caused by armies. Sometimes the most powerful empires can be brought down by an enemy too small to see, leaving only ghosts and unanswered questions. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. Stay curious, question everything, and remember the truth is often buried deeper than we think.